The 19th of June 1944, Philippine Sea, Mariana Islands. The 121st Squadron of the United States Navy, aboard the USS Enterprise under the command of Colonel Murray H. Rieger, prepared for a crucial aerial combat mission. Tension hung in the air as engines roared to life. From the opposite side, Japan's 251st Squadron, commanded by Colonel Yoshio Miyamoto, was also gearing up for the intense battle ahead. Both sides knew this would be a fight to the death. Each was confident in its ability to dominate the skies, yet neither expected the shift in tactics that was about to unfold. The sky grew crowded as the planes took off. The F6F Hellcats of the U.S. dove into action, their sharp turns cutting through the air, while the Japanese A6M-0s surged forward with lethal speed. The space felt constricted, the tension palpable. Then, out of nowhere, one of the Zeros failed to react in time as a Hellcat from above swooped down. It happened so quickly, like a strike from the heavens. The Japanese pilot barely had time to register the attack before his plane was struck, bursting into flames as it plummeted to the sea. The loss of the Japanese pilot was a brutal shock. The A6M-0, once the undisputed ruler of the skies, had been torn apart by the might of the Hellcat. The Japanese forces, accustomed to the advantage, were stunned by the speed and power of the American aircraft. The Japanese squadron was thrown into confusion. The American pilots pressed on relentless as they continued their assault without hesitation. They knew this was the moment to turn the tide. With speed and firepower far superior to the Zero, the Hellcat left no room for retaliation. Each shot, each attack reaffirmed the dominance of a new era in aerial combat. Not only did one plane fall, but an entire strategic belief of Japan collapsed in an instant. The once reliable Zero was no longer a force to be reckoned with, leaving Japan's pilots in a state of shock and disbelief. Their long-held belief in the superiority of their tactics was shattered in the blink of an eye. The 19th of June, 1944, marked a critical moment in the Pacific War as the United States and Japan clashed over the Marianas Islands. For the U.S., achieving air superiority was paramount to securing the region and continuing their island-hopping campaign. For Japan, this battle represented the last opportunity to stop the American advance and defend their empire from further destruction. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, part of the broader Marianas campaign, would be remembered as one of the largest naval battles in history, and it became a defining moment for the air forces of both nations. For Japan, the A6M-0 had been the symbol of air dominance in the early years of the war. But as the conflict progressed, the Zero's vulnerabilities were exposed, especially against new American aircraft like the F6F Hellcat. The Zero was a lightweight, highly maneuverable fighter that had been highly effective in early battles thanks to its agility and firepower. However, it was not designed to contend with aircraft like the Hellcat, which combined speed, armament, and durability in a way the Zero could not match. The Hellcat was the result of years of development aimed at countering the Zero's strengths, and by mid-1944, it had proven its superiority in various encounters. Its greater firepower and sturdier build allowed it to withstand enemy fire longer and return to combat more frequently. In the days leading up to the battle, both sides were acutely aware of the stakes. The Japanese had been stretched thin, defending multiple fronts in the Pacific, while the U.S. had ramped up its industrial output, creating a nearly endless supply of aircraft and weapons. The Marianas were strategically significant. If the U.S. were to seize control, it would cut off Japan's remaining supplies of oil and other vital resources from Southeast Asia and place American bombers within range of Japan's home islands. The Japanese Navy, reliant on the Zero and its traditional tactics of dogfighting, had not adapted as quickly as the U.S. to the changing nature of aerial warfare. The Zeros, while effective at close-range combat, were outmatched in longer engagements and lacked the range to compete with the Hellcat, which had been designed to fight from greater distances. As the battle unfolded, the tactical edge that Japan had once held began to slip away, and it became clear that their reliance on the Zero could no longer guarantee victory. American pilots flying the Hellcat were equipped with the most advanced technology available at the time. The Hellcat's powerful, 50-caliber machine guns could shred the Zero's lightweight airframe in seconds, and its stronger engine and greater maneuverability made it a difficult target for the nimble Zero. As the Hellcats engaged the Zeros in dogfights over the Philippine Sea, the Japanese pilots quickly realized they were no longer facing the same American aircraft they had encountered in previous battles. The Zero, which had once ruled the skies, was being systematically destroyed by the new American fighter. The impact of the Hellcats' dominance over the Zeros was immediate and profound. As the battle raged, the Japanese forces began to experience the collapse of their air superiority. The Zero was no longer the feared aircraft it had once been. In fact, the battle became a massacre for the Japanese air forces, with hundreds of their aircraft being destroyed. American pilots, on the other hand, sustained minimal losses, largely due to the Hellcats' advanced capabilities. For Japan, the loss of air superiority meant more than just the loss of aircraft. It signaled a deeper strategic crisis. Without control of the skies, Japan's ability to defend its territories and launch counterattacks was severely diminished. The failure to stop the American advance in the Marianas marked a turning point in the war, one that would lead to the eventual collapse of Japan's military power in the Pacific. The stakes were high and both sides knew it. The U.S. was not only fighting to secure a foothold in the Pacific, they were fighting to ensure the eventual defeat of Japan. For Japan, the Marianas represented the last stand to preserve their empire, and the loss of air superiority meant the crumbling of their strategic defenses. As the battle ended, the U.S. Navy had claimed a decisive victory. The Hellcat, which had already proven itself as a formidable weapon in previous engagements, was now firmly established as the dominant fighter in the Pacific. The Japanese, though still formidable on the ground, had lost their edge in the skies. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had shifted the momentum in favor of the United States and set the stage for the eventual American victory in the Pacific. It was clear that the war would not be won with outdated tactics and aircraft. Japan would need to innovate or face defeat. The battle was not just a victory for the U.S. military, but a clear demonstration of the shifting technological balance between the two nations. It was also a testament to the adaptability and resilience of the American forces, who had not only outproduced the Japanese, but had developed the tactical and technological advantage needed to decisively win the air war in the Pacific. With the Hellcat leading the way, the U.S. Navy would continue to dominate the skies, ensuring that Japan's days of aerial superiority were over. The A6M-0, Japan's most iconic fighter, had been the backbone of the Imperial Navy's air forces for much of the early Pacific War. Known for its exceptional agility and lightweight design, the Zero excelled in dogfights and could outmaneuver almost any enemy aircraft in close combat. Its thin, durable airframe, combined with its powerful armament, made it a deadly opponent in the right hands. However, as the war progressed, the limitations of the Zero became increasingly apparent. The aircraft was not designed to withstand prolonged engagements or heavy damage. Its lightweight construction made it fast and agile but vulnerable to sustained fire. Furthermore, the Zero was no match for the range and firepower of American fighters, especially as U.S. technology advanced. The A6M's engine, though powerful, lacked the horsepower to match newer Allied aircraft in both speed and altitude. The arrival of the F6F Hellcat in 1943 marked a turning point in aerial combat. The Hellcat was developed as a direct response to the limitations of the earlier F4F Wildcat. It was faster, more heavily armed, and far more durable than its predecessors. Equipped with 6 50-caliber machine guns, the Hellcat could deliver a devastating volume of fire that the Zero could not withstand. Its reinforced airframe and self-sealing fuel tanks made it much more resistant to damage, and its powerful engine allowed it to match or exceed the Zero in both speed and climb rate. The Hellcat's superior firepower and resilience quickly made it a force to be reckoned with in the Pacific. Unlike the Zero, which relied on short-range dogfights and high-speed maneuvers, the Hellcat was built for sustained combat. Its long-range capabilities allowed it to engage the enemy from a distance, and its speed and agility made it deadly in close combat as well. As a result, the Hellcat was able to engage Japanese aircraft from a position of strength, outgunning and outlasting the Zero in almost every encounter. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which took place in June 1944, was a decisive moment in the war and a showcase for the Hellcats' dominance. As the United States launched its offensive in the Mariana Islands, the Japanese Navy mobilized its air forces to try and stop the American advance. The Zero, which had been the cornerstone of Japan's air strategy, was now facing a new adversary in the form of the Hellcat. The battle quickly revealed the disparities in technology and tactics between the two sides. The Zero's once feared maneuverability was no match for the Hellcat's advanced design and firepower. The U.S. Navy pilots flying Hellcats had the advantage of superior training and technology, while the Japanese pilots, despite their skill and experience, were increasingly unable to cope with the overwhelming power of the American fighters. As the battle unfolded, the differences in combat tactics became evident. American pilots used their Hellcats to devastating effect, engaging Japanese aircraft from a distance and using their superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm the enemy. The Zero, which had once dominated the skies, could no longer keep up with the Hellcat's long-range capabilities and its ability to withstand damage and keep fighting. In the face of the Hellcat's overwhelming firepower, the Japanese pilots found themselves at a disadvantage. While the Zero remained an agile and dangerous aircraft in skilled hands, it was no longer the superior fighter it once had been. The Hellcat's ability to engage from longer distances, its superior armor, and its devastating firepower proved to be the decisive factors in the battle. The Japanese forces were forced to adapt quickly, but their efforts were largely in vain. The Hellcat's superiority was clear, and the battle quickly turned in favor of the U.S. By the end of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese had lost a significant portion of their air forces, with the U.S. achieving a remarkable kill ratio. The loss of air superiority in the Pacific marked a turning point in the war, signaling the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance in the sky. The Hellcat had proven itself not only as a powerful weapon, but as the key to shifting the balance of power in the Pacific theater. The superiority of the Hellcat was not just a technological leap forward. It represented the effectiveness of American tactics and industrial might. The ability to mass-produce aircraft and adapt them to meet the challenges of modern warfare was a defining characteristic of the U.S. military. As the Hellcat proved, American innovation and resilience would ultimately be the deciding factors in the Pacific War, as Japan's once dominant air forces were overwhelmed by a more advanced and adaptable foe. In the aftermath of the battle, the Hellcat would go on to play a crucial role in securing victory for the United States in the Pacific. Its technological superiority, combined with the skill of American pilots, would ensure that the Zero would never again hold the skies over the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the pivotal role that aircraft technology and strategic adaptation would play in the outcome of the war. The sky above the Philippine Sea was filled with tension as the battle raged on. For the Japanese pilots, this was a fight like none before. The A6M0 had been their weapon of dominance throughout the early Pacific War, and their skills had been honed in the crucible of dogfights. Yet as the Hellcats of the U.S. Navy closed in, that dominance began to crumble. For a Japanese fighter pilot, the feeling of preparing for battle was always a mixture of confidence and dread. They knew their aircraft well. Its lightweight frame and agility were unmatched in the right hands. The Zero was designed for agility, a weapon that thrived in the intense maneuvers of close combat. As the enemy approached, the familiar hum of the engines and the rush of adrenaline would take over. However, the American fighters were not what they expected. The Hellcats came in with a sense of precision and speed that seemed different from the previous American aircraft. The Zero had been the superior dogfighter, but the Hellcat's firepower, durability, and speed put it on an entirely different level. In the heat of combat, the Japanese pilots' confidence would quickly begin to waver. At first, it was easy to believe that the Zero's agility would outmaneuver the Hellcat, but the American fighters had no intention of engaging in the kind of close-range dogfights that had been the Zero's strength. The Hellcats maintained distance using their superior firepower to strike with devastating accuracy. The Zero, once a deadly predator, was now feeling the pressure. The realization hit hard. The Zero's agility alone wasn't enough against an aircraft that could not only match its speed but also withstand far more damage. In the midst of the battle, a Japanese pilot might feel the sickening sensation of his aircraft taking fire. The Hellcats, 50 caliber machine guns, could tear through the Zero's thin frame with frightening ease. A direct hit would result in an almost immediate burst of flame, and the realization would set in that the Zero was no longer invincible. The once proud aircraft which had dominated the skies was no longer the superior weapon it had once been. As the Zero fell from the sky, the pilot's thoughts would be filled with disbelief. How could the once feared Zero be so easily destroyed? On the American side, the Hellcat pilots had their own unique experience in the cockpit. Unlike the Japanese, who had grown accustomed to dominance in the air, the American pilots knew their aircraft was a tool of precision and survival. Their Hellcats were designed to survive the harshest of conditions and emerge victorious. The American pilots had already felt the sting of combat, having seen firsthand how deadly the Zero could be. But now, with the Hellcat, they were ready to fight back. For the Hellcat pilots, every mission was an exercise in professionalism and focus. They had trained for this moment, knowing the importance of their mission to gain air superiority and protect their fellow soldiers in the bombers. As they saw the Zeros appear on the horizon, the thrill of battle was tempered by the knowledge that this was a critical moment. The outcome of the war would depend on their ability to perform. When a Zero was shot down, there was no time for celebration. Every moment counted in this fast-paced battle, and there was always another enemy fighter to engage. The American pilots relied on the superior speed and power of the Hellcat to keep the Zeros at bay. The moment of satisfaction was fleeting, always followed by the urgency of the next mission. As one Japanese plane fell, another would quickly take its place. The fight never stopped, and the Hellcat pilots knew their role to outlast and outgun the enemy until the skies were clear. But even in their success, the American pilots were aware that it was not just their training or skill that made the difference, it was the aircraft they were flying. The Hellcat had been designed to counter the Zero, and it was proving to be a deadly weapon. With its superior range, speed and firepower, the Hellcat was dominating the battlefield in a way that the Zero could not match. It was a constant reminder that in warfare, technology and innovation were just as important as skill and experience. On the other side, the Japanese pilots found themselves grappling with the reality that their tactics were no longer enough. The Zero, which had once been the weapon of choice for the most elite pilots, was now facing an adversary that could match it at every turn. The once proud aircraft had become a symbol of their decline in the air, a realization that could not be easily accepted. Each encounter with the Hellcat was a reminder of how quickly the balance of power had shifted. The dogfights that had once seemed so manageable now felt like a desperate struggle for survival. For the Hellcat pilots, the battle was a brutal test of endurance and focus. They knew that their success was not just about individual victories, but about the larger strategy of the war. Each plane shot down, each mission completed, brought them one step closer to securing victory. The stakes were high, and there was no room for mistakes. But with the Hellcat at their side, the American pilots had the upper hand, and they intended to use it to its fullest advantage. The battle over the Philippine Sea would be remembered not just for the number of planes shot down, but for the moment when the Zero's reign over the skies was finally brought to an end. The United States' success in the Pacific War was not solely due to superior technology, but also to the adaptation of new tactics, strategies, and logistics. The introduction of the F6F Hellcat fighter represented a significant shift in the way the U.S. Navy approached aerial combat. The Hellcat was part of a broader evolution in American military strategy that prioritized technological innovation and operational flexibility. The Navy's approach to combat in the Pacific began to focus on overwhelming firepower mobility and the use of coordinated strikes, making full use of the Hellcat's capabilities. Unlike earlier American fighters which had struggled in one-on-one dogfights with Japanese aircraft, the Hellcat was designed to engage in longer-range combat while maintaining firepower and durability. This was a direct response to the tactics employed by the Japanese, who had relied heavily on the dogfighting abilities of the A6M0. American pilots flying the Hellcat could now engage the enemy from a safer distance, using their aircraft's superior range and firepower to strike the enemy before the Zero could close the gap. This tactical shift was a product of the broader strategic decisions made by the United States. particularly by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The Navy's new approach emphasized carrier-based operations, allowing the U.S. to project power across vast stretches of the Pacific. The shift from defensive operations to offensive air superiority was supported by advancements in intelligence, reconnaissance, and logistics, which allowed American forces to maintain pressure on Japanese forces and keep them constantly on the defensive. Meanwhile, Japan's military leaders remained committed to traditional tactics and doctrines. Their approach to naval warfare, known as Kantai Kessen, was built around the idea of a decisive battle between fleets. However, as the war progressed, Japan's reliance on large surface battleships and its outdated air tactics became increasingly ineffective against the more dynamic American strategy. The Zero, which had once been the backbone of Japan's naval air forces, was increasingly unable to cope with the newer American aircraft that combined better firepower, speed, and endurance. While Japan struggled with tactical and strategic inflexibility, the United States was able to adapt quickly, leveraging its vast industrial capacity to produce weapons at a rate Japan could not match. The U.S. produced thousands of aircraft every month, ensuring that their pilots had an inexhaustible supply of new planes. The Hellcat was a prime example of this industrial might. Not only did it meet the immediate needs of the U.S. Navy, but its design was also simple enough to allow for rapid production and repair, further enhancing its effectiveness in combat. In contrast, Japan's industrial base was much smaller, and its war effort was increasingly hampered by resource shortages. Japan struggled to replace its aircraft losses and faced a severe lack of raw materials, particularly after the Allied blockade severely limited access to critical resources like oil and aluminum. This disparity in production capabilities became a key factor in the downfall of Japan's air forces. As the U.S. Navy produced more and more Hellcats, Japan's ability to field effective combat aircraft steadily declined. At the same time, the logistical support for the Hellcat was crucial to its success. The U.S. Navy's ability to sustain operations across the Pacific with its vast network of bases and maintenance facilities allowed pilots to continue flying missions without the same concerns about aircraft reliability and maintenance that plagued the Japanese. The extensive American logistical infrastructure enabled Hellcats to stay in the air longer and return to combat quickly, unlike the Japanese forces who struggled to maintain their planes in the face of constant Allied pressure. The strategic decisions made by the U.S. were not just about producing better aircraft, but about creating a system that could adapt to the changing dynamics of the war. The rise of the Hellcat was part of a broader effort to outproduce and outmaneuver the Japanese at every turn. The U.S. Navy's ability to conduct sustained air campaigns across the Pacific with their superior aircraft and advanced logistics gave them a decisive edge in battles like the Battle of the Philippine Sea. As Japan's resources dwindled, the United States used its industrial might to build the tools of victory. Japan, on the other hand, was hampered by strategic miscalculations and a failure to modernize their forces quickly enough. Despite having early successes in the war, Japan's inability to adapt to the evolving nature of aerial combat and the shifting balance of power in the Pacific ultimately led to their defeat. The Japanese military leadership failed to recognize the importance of technological innovation in the same way the US had. They continued to rely on tactics and aircraft that had been successful in the early years of the war, but were increasingly outdated by 1944. The U.S. victory in the Pacific was not just the result of better aircraft, but also of superior logistics, industrial capacity, and adaptive military strategy. The Hellcat, though an outstanding aircraft in its own right, was part of a broader system that allowed the U.S. to outproduce and outfight the Japanese. Japan's failure to match the U.S. in any of these areas was the primary reason for their ultimate defeat. The battle for the skies over the Pacific, exemplified by the success of the Hellcat, demonstrated the critical role of innovation and adaptation in modern warfare. In the aftermath of the battle, the U.S. Navy would continue to dominate the skies over the Pacific, securing air superiority and paving the way for the final stages of the war. Japan's inability to adapt to the technological and tactical changes of the war left them unable to cope with the overwhelming power of the American military. The rise of the Hellcat symbolized not just a victory in one battle, but the broader strategic shift that would ensure American success in the Pacific War. The A6M0 had long been Japan's symbol of superiority in the Pacific War. Introduced in the early stages of the conflict, it quickly became the backbone of Japan's aerial strategy, feared for its agility and its ability to outmaneuver nearly every Allied fighter. It dominated the skies in the early battles, and its reputation was solidified by victories at Pearl Harbor and throughout Southeast Asia. The Zero's lightweight frame and powerful armament made it a formidable opponent, and Japanese pilots, highly trained and experienced, were well matched for the dogfights that often followed. However, by the time the Battle of the Philippine Sea took place in June 1944, the Zero's invincibility had begun to fade. The arrival of newer Allied aircraft, particularly the F6F Hellcat, marked the beginning of the end for the Zero. While the Zero was still an agile and capable fighter, it was increasingly vulnerable to the newer American aircraft, which were faster, more heavily armed, and more durable. The Zero's agility, once its greatest strength, was no longer enough to overcome the superior technology of the Hellcat. As the Hellcats engaged in combat over the Philippine Sea, the true extent of the Zero's limitations became apparent. The Hellcat was designed to exploit these weaknesses. Its powerful armament, combined with its superior durability, allowed it to outlast the Zero in extended engagements. The Hellcat could absorb more damage and still return to the fight, while the Zero's fragile frame made it prone to quick destruction once hit. Moreover, the Hellcat's superior speed and range allowed it to engage from greater distances, making it much harder for the Zero to close in and use its agility to its advantage. For the Japanese pilots, the realization that their once dominant aircraft could no longer hold its ground was a harsh blow. The myth of the Zero, once seen as the ultimate fighter, began to collapse. The Japanese pilots, who had long relied on the Zero's unmatched maneuverability, now found themselves outclassed by the Hellcat. Despite their skill and experience, the Japanese pilots were increasingly overwhelmed by the Hellcat's firepower, speed, and resilience. The collapse of the Zero myth was not just a technical defeat, it was a psychological blow to Japan's military. The Zero had represented Japan's early successes in the war, and its dominance in the skies was a source of national pride. To have that myth shattered in the face of a superior enemy aircraft was a profound humiliation. It became clear that Japan's traditional tactics, based on the Zero's strengths, were no longer viable in the changing dynamics of the war. This shift in air superiority was not just a result of better technology, it was also due to the American strategy of adaptation. While Japan remained wedded to its old tactics and its reliance on the Zero, the United States had continually adapted its approach. The Hellcat was a product of this adaptability, built specifically to counter the Zero's advantages. Its development was a direct response to the lessons learned from previous engagements, such as the limitations of the F4F Wildcat. The Hellcat's superior design, combined with the U.S. Navy's ability to mass-produce aircraft, gave the American forces a decisive edge. On the Japanese side, the inability to replace aircraft quickly enough and the dwindling resources for war production made it increasingly difficult to keep up with the U.S. military's advancements. While the United States could continue to produce large numbers of Hellcats and other advanced aircraft, Japan struggled with its industrial capacity. The loss of the Zero was symptomatic of a broader failure to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. Japan's decision-making, particularly regarding production and tactics, was slow and inflexible, and this cost them dearly in the face of America's superior industrial and technological might. The loss of air superiority in the Pacific was a turning point in the war. Once Japan had ruled the skies, but now the balance had shifted. The Hellcat, along with other American technological advancements, ensured that the United States would maintain control of the air, crucial to the success of the island-hopping campaign and eventual victory. The Zero's fall from dominance was not just the loss of a single aircraft, it was the collapse of a myth that had sustained Japan's hope for victory. The collapse of the Zero and Japan's air superiority also highlighted the broader shift in the war's strategic landscape. The battle for the skies, once seen as a contest between two rivals with roughly equal strength, had tilted decisively in favor of the United States. The Hellcats' success demonstrated not only the superiority of American aircraft, but also the broader shift in how the U.S. approached the war through innovation, adaptability, and the overwhelming power of industrial production. The fall of the Zero was a symbolic moment in the Pacific War, marking the end of Japan's hopes for air dominance and signaling the beginning of a new phase in the conflict. As the U.S. continued to press its advantage in the skies, the Japanese were left struggling to catch up, unable to overcome the technological gap that had opened up between them. The myth of the Zero, once a source of pride and a symbol of Japan's early success, had collapsed, and with it, the foundation of Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific War, signaling the end of Japan's ability to maintain air superiority. The collapse of the A6M-0, once the cornerstone of Japanese air power, was a severe blow to Japan's military. The Hellcats' superiority in combat shattered the myth of the Zero as an invincible fighter. As the battle unfolded, the Japanese realized their once dominant aircraft could no longer compete with the American fighters' firepower, durability, and operational range. This defeat in the skies signaled a broader shift in the war, where American technological superiority and industrial might would now dominate. In the short term, the immediate consequences for Japan were dire. The loss of air superiority meant that their ability to defend key positions in the Pacific was severely compromised. The U.S. could now freely execute its island-hopping strategy, securing strategic islands and getting closer to Japan's home islands. Japan's military was on the defensive, unable to replace the aircraft it lost at the same pace as the U.S. The psychological impact of the battle was also significant for Japan, as the once unbeatable Zero was rendered obsolete. For the United States, the victory was a confirmation of the effectiveness of its industrial capacity and adaptive military strategy. The Hellcats' performance in the battle cemented its place as a critical weapon in securing victory in the Pacific. Its ability to outgun, outlast, and outperform the Zero marked a turning point in air combat, reinforcing the U.S. Navy's dominance in the region. Looking to the long term, the collapse of the Zero was part of a larger trend of Japanese strategic failure. Japan had failed to adapt quickly enough to the changing nature of aerial warfare, sticking to outdated tactics and over-relying on a single aircraft model. In contrast, the United States, through its ability to innovate and produce advanced aircraft like the Hellcat, ensured that its forces could continue to adapt to new challenges. The U.S. Navy's overwhelming advantage in aircraft production and technological development made it increasingly difficult for Japan to maintain any real resistance. The Hellcats' role in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and its effectiveness in later battles marked the end of Japan's air superiority. As the U.S. continued to press forward, Japan's ability to wage war in the Pacific diminished. The shift in the balance of power had been completed. The U.S. would go on to win the war, but the collapse of Japan's air forces represented a key factor in that victory. In the aftermath, the question remained how much of Japan's defeat was due to superior American technology, and how much to their failure to adapt their strategy. The end of the Zero's dominance signaled a broader collapse of Japan's hopes for a decisive victory, and with that the Pacific War moved toward its inevitable conclusion. The next chapter would see U.S. forces pushing closer to Japan with more intense battles ahead.